James.
We're picking up today with the book of James, and James is somewhat over history, has been a controversial book. Martin Luther thought it might be burned up in the judgment, that it was part of the wood, hay, and stubble, because he had this great revelation about, we're justified by faith, and then in the book of James, there's a point where James says we're justified by works and not by faith, and so we'll look at that as we go through. So it's been somewhat controversial. There were two apostles of Jesus that were named James. James, the son of Zebedee, and James, the son of Alphaeus. And the writer of this book is neither one of those. The writer of this book is James, the brother, the half-brother of Jesus, the son of Mary and Joseph. And so he became very prominent in the church after James, the son of Zebedee, was martyred, was killed. And so when we look at Acts chapter 15, the James that's spoken about there is this James. And it's somehow James, although he wasn't a believer in Jesus early on, it says in John 7:5 that not even his brothers, his family, were believing in him. They were kind of coming around like, we got to get this guy out of this situation. He sounded a little bit crazy or whatever. There was definitely a change in James, probably at the resurrection. I mean, a lot of people at the crucifixion, resurrection, when Jesus rose from the dead, that kind of sealed it. It's like, I think he is who he said he was, and his words are true. So he simply describes himself not as, I mean, if I was the half-brother of Jesus, I think I would have thrown that out there a lot. Like, I was raised in the same house, whatever. He just says, James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. That's how he introduces himself at the beginning of this letter. And, this letter, it's named James, and it's not like Timothy. The books of Timothy are written to Timothy. This isn't written to James. This is written from James. This is James writing. And so he's, and the book is written in a lot different way than a lot of the New Testament. It's very unique for the New Testament. It sounds more like Proverbs. But it's also along the line of maybe the Sermon on the Mount. It's like little bits of wisdom just put in one after another. It's not telling a story, particularly it's not a historical book. It's giving you these little bits of wisdom, and also any books like this, you can see by the content that it's addressing certain problems that were coming up in the church, like his talk about works rather than just faith. It's probably because people were sitting around doing nothing and say, yeah, I believe. They believed, but they didn't do anything with their faith. And so if I believe that the only way I can be saved from this attack is run out of this room because there's a hand grenade over here about to go off, but I don't do anything about it, my faith is worthless because I believed, but it just blew me up because I wouldn't move. And so he's just saying there is some action that needs to accompany your faith. And I don't think it's a contradiction with what Luther's revelation was out of Romans, that we're justified by faith and not works, because there the contrast was not doing something. The contrast was basically, you're not saved by the works of the law. You're not saved by getting circumcised. You're not saved by keeping the Sabbath. You're not saved by doing any of those things. You're not saved by the works of the law. What you're saved by is faith in the grace of God. So we're going to pick up here. Oh, one other thing about James is he was known in the early church. They called him camel knees because he prayed so much that apparently his knees became like calloused because he spent so much time on his knees. And so what a heritage to have like that. I got to get busy because my knees are in too good a shape right now. They to be called camel knees. So. We'll look at some of the themes in here, but basically what we're looking at is just there's little bits of wisdom. There's a lot of things in James that are very quotable, that are very, things that hold on to people's faith, that catch on. And so it's a good book to really become familiar with. In fact, years ago when I was an early Christian, I memorized, I think, the first 4 chapters, or maybe 3.5. I had most of the book memorized, and every day I would go over and I would start at the beginning. And just in my thinking, I'd go over the whole book until I got to the point, to the end of where I had it memorized, and then try to add a verse or two. So I learned these first few chapters pretty well by just going over and over them in my mind. So we're going to start out with just looking at the first 8 verses here. It says, James, a bondservant of God and of our Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad, greetings. So it sounds like he's writing to kind of a Jewish audience. Consider it all joy, my brethren, Jewish believers in Jesus, that is. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials. Now, this is like a major, that we can read that so quickly, but what a big admonition. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials. Well, that's usually like the last thing we're going to do. When we have a trial, is to consider it all joy. But he says there's a reason for that, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith without any doubting, for the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man expect that he will receive anything from the Lord, being double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. So he gives us an exhortation here both about wisdom and about faith. If you lack wisdom, ask God and be confident in your asking, because he wants to give you wisdom. And he says, when you ask in faith, don't be double-minded. Believe that he wants to do it. The double-minded one, he says, is like a ship tossed on the sea. It's a good word picture he gives here. And he says he's double-minded, unstable in all his ways. He says, don't let that man expect he's going to receive anything from the Lord. Okay, well, that puts you on, okay, so we need to operate in faith, believing what God has said. And so you go through this first chapter, verse 12, blessed is a man who perseveres under trial, same kind of theme. For once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. So he's saying we need to persevere in that time of trial, in that time of testing. And the goal here is actually that end goal. And it says if you do that, you'll receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. And then he goes through this concept of temptation. And he talks about this. And in verse 13, he says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. Then he goes through this sequence, and it's really interesting to look at this. And you can break this down in your own life and be aware what level you are, what sequence you're in the idea of temptation. He says, but each one is tempted when he is carried away, enticed by his own lust. So first, it's the lust of the flesh that's tempting us. It's our own desires in our being that are tempting us. And those whatever's out there, we, because of the nature, our nature, we're given to want to do those things that are sinful. It says, then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. So when lust, it's not only drawing you, but also when it has some substance, when it is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And it's like when David saw Bathsheba, he was tempted. He saw her, he was tempted. Then when he gave in to that temptation, the lust of his flesh, as it says here, when lust was conceived, it gives birth to sin. His literally kind of followed this pattern. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. We can see that pattern in what happened with David. First he looked, he was tempted, then he gave into it. It resulted in sin, and literally after that, it resulted in death. It brings forth death. That's separation. And so we've got to watch it from that level. First, we've got to understand we're not being tempted by God. God's not tempting us. It's the law of the flesh that's working in us, that's tempting us by the things that we see. If we give into that lust, that temptation, then it brings forth sin. And when sin is accomplished, there's always some kind of death that takes place. Sin seems pleasant for the season, but the long term, you never know what's really up ahead, what's going to happen. Sin never tells you the price you're going to have to pay. It never tells you how long you're going to have to stay. And, it doesn't do that at the front end. You don't know how long you're going to stay. You don't know the price you're going to have to pay. But if you understand this and this process, you understand that our lust, when it gives forth, when we give into our lust, it results in sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. I think those are some great wisdom here to understand. And then he goes on to say, don't be deceived. Every good thing bestowed and every perfect gift from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with which there's no variation or shifting shadow. Everything, every perfect gift and every good gift comes from God. He says, don't be deceived. So whatever's good, the good things that come, those things are from God, and we need to understand that He's not tempting us with evil. His desire is to give us those good gifts.